Then she gulped and said, "I see no one, sir, no one, Amos," said Mr. Crouch curtly. "I am fully aware that, in the ordinary course of events, you would want to take Winky into your department for questioning. I ask you, however, to allow me to deal with her." Mr. Diggory looked as though he didn't think much of this suggestion at all, but it was clear to Harry that Mr. Crouch was such an important member of the ministry that he did not dare refuse him. "You may rest assured that she will be punished," Mr. Crouch added coldly. Master," Winky stammered, looking up at Mr. Crouch, her eyes brimming with tears. Master, please." Mr. Crouch stared back, his face somehow sharpened, each line upon it more deeply etched. There was no pity in his gaze. "Winky has behaved tonight in a manner I would not have believed possible," he said slowly. "I told her to remain in the tent. I told her to stay there while I went to sort out the trouble, and I find that she disobeyed me. This means clothes." "No!" shrieked Winky, prostrating herself at Mr. Crouch's feet. "No, master, not clothes, not clothes." Harry knew that the only way to turn a house elf free was to present it with proper garments. It was pitiful to see the way Winky clutched at her tea towel as she sobbed over Mr. Crouch's feet. "But she was frightened," Hermione burst out angrily, glaring at Mr. Crouch. "Your elf is scared of heights, and those wizards in masks were levitating people. You can't blame her for wanting to get out of their way." Mr. Crouch took a step backwards, freeing himself from contact with the elf, whom he was surveying as though he was something filthy and rotten that was contaminating his overshined shoes. "I have no use for a house elf who disobeys me," he said coldly, looking up at Hermione. "I have no use for a servant who forgets what is due to her master and to her master's reputation." Winky was crying so hard that her sobs echoed around the clearing. There was a very nasty silence, which was ended by Mr. Weasley, who said quietly, "Well, I think I'll take my lot back to the tent, if nobody's got any objections. Amos, the wand's told us all it can. If Harry could have it back, please." Mr. Diggory handed Harry his wand, and Harry pocketed it. "Come on, you three," Mr. Weasley said quietly. But Hermione didn't seem to want to move. Her eyes were still upon the sobbing elf. "Hermione," Mr. Weasley said, more urgently. She turned and followed Harry and Ron out of the clearing and off through the trees. "What's going to happen to Winky?" said Hermione, the moment they had left the clearing. "I don't know," said Mr. Weasley. "The way they were treating her," said Hermione furiously. "Mr. Diggory calling her Alf all the time. And Mr. Crouch, he knows she didn't do it, and he's still going to sack her. He didn't care how frightened she'd been, or how upset she was. It was like she wasn't human, even human." "Well, she's not," said Ron. Hermione rounded on him. "That doesn't mean that she's not got feelings, Ron. It's disgusting the way—" "Hermione, I agree with you," said Mr. Weasley quickly, beckoning her on. "But now was not the time to discuss elf rights. I want to get back to the tent as fast as we can. What happened to the others?" "We lost them in the dark," said Ron. "Dad, why was everyone so upset about the skull thing?" "I'll explain everything back at the tent," he said tensely. But when they reached the edge of the wood, their progress was impeded. A large crowd of frightened-looking witches and wizards was congregating there, and when they saw Mr. Weasley coming towards them, many of them surged forwards. "What's going on in there? Who conjured it? Arthur, it's not him." "Of course it's not him," said Mr. Weasley impatiently. "We don't know who it is. It looks like they disapparated. Now excuse me, please. I want to get to bed." He led Harry, Ron, and Hermione through the crowd and back into the campsite. All was quiet now. There was no sign of masked wizards. Through several ruined tents, though several ruined tents were still smoking. Charlie's head was poking out of the boys' tent. "Dad, what's going on?" he called through the dark. "Fred, George, and Ginny got back okay, but the others, I've got them here." said Mr. Weasley, bending down and entering the tent. Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered after him. Bill was sitting at the small kitchen table, holding a bedsheet to his arm, which was bleeding profusely. Charlie had a large rip in his shirt, and Percy was sporting a bloody nose. Fred, George, and Ginny looked unhurt, though shaken. "Didn't you get them, Dad?" said Bill sharply. "The person who conjured the mark." "No," said Mr. Weasley. "We found Barty Crouch's elf holding Harry's wand, but we are none the wiser about who actually conjured the mark." "What?" said Bill, Charlie, and Percy together. "Harry's wand," said Fred. "Mr. Crouch's elf," said Percy, sounding thunderstruck. With some assistance from Harry, Ron, and Hermione, Mr. Weasley explained what had happened in the woods. When they had finished their story, Percy swelled indignantly. "Well, Mr. Crouch is quite right to get rid of an elf like that," he said, running away when he'd expressly told her not to, embarrassing him in front of the whole ministry. How would that have looked if she'd been had up in front of the Department of the Regulation of Control? "She didn't do anything. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time," Hermione snapped at Percy, who looked very taken back. Hermione had always gotten on fairly well with Percy, better indeed than any of the others. "Hermione, a wizard in Mr. Crouch's position can't afford a house elf who's going to run amok with a wand," said Percy pompously, recovering himself. "She didn't run amok," shouted Hermione. "She just picked it up off the ground." "Look, can someone just explain what that skull thing was?" said Ron impatiently. "It wasn't hurting anyone. Why is it such a big deal?" "I told you, it's you-know-who symbol, Ron," said Hermione. "Before anyone else could answer, I read about it in the Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts, and it hasn't been seen for 13 years, said Mr. Weasley quietly. Of course people panicked. It was almost like seeing you-know-who back again. "I don't get it," said Ron, frowning. "I mean, it's still only a shape in the sky." "Ron, you-know-who and his followers sent the dark mark into the air whenever they killed," said Mr. Weasley. "The terror it inspired, you have no idea. You're too young. Just picture coming home and finding the dark mark hovering over your house, and knowing that what you're about to find inside." Mr. Weasley winced. Everyone's worst fear, the very worst. There was silence for a moment. Then Bill removed the sheet from his arm and checked out his cut, and said, "Well, it didn't help us tonight, whoever conjured it. It scared the Death Eaters away the moment they saw it. They are all disapparated before we'd gotten near enough to unmask any of them. We got the Robertses before they could hit the ground, though. They're having their memories modified right now." "Death Eaters," said Harry. "What are Death Eaters?" "It's what you-know-who supporters called themselves," said Bill. "I think we saw what's left of them tonight. The ones who managed to keep themselves out of Azkaban, anyway." "We can't prove it was them, Bill," said Mr. Weasley, "though it probably was," he added hopelessly. "Yeah, I bet it was," said Ron suddenly. "Dad, we met Draco Malfoy in the woods, and he was good as told us that his dad was one of those nutters in masks. And we all know the Malfoys were right in with you-know-who." "But what were Voldemort's supporters?" Harry began. Everybody flinched. Like most of the wizarding world, the Weasleys always avoided saying Voldemort's name. "Sorry," said Harry quickly. "What were you-know-who supporters up to, levitating muggles? I mean, what was the point?" "The point," said Mr. Weasley, with a hollow laugh, "Harry, that's their idea of fun. Half of the muggle killings back when you-know-who was in power were done for fun. I suppose they had a few drinks tonight and couldn't resist reminding us all that lots of them are still at large. A nice little reunion for them," he finished disgustedly. "But if they were the Death Eaters, why did they disapparate when they saw the dark mark?" said Ron. "They'd have been pleased to see it, wouldn't they?" "Use your brain, Ron," said Bill. "If they really were Death Eaters, they've worked really hard to keep out of Azkaban when you-know-who lost power, and told all sorts of lies about him, forcing them to kill and torture people. I bet they'd be even more frightened than the rest of us to see him come back. They denied that they'd been involved with him when he lost his power and went back to their daily lives. I don't reckon he'd be overpleased with them, do you? So, whoever conjured the dark mark, said Hermione slowly, were they doing it to show support for the Death Eaters, or to scare them away? Your guess is as good as ours, Hermione, said Mr. Weasley, but you'll tell them... No, but I'll tell you this. It was only the Death Eaters who ever knew how to conjure it. I'd be very surprised if the person who did it hadn't been a Death Eater once, even if they're not now. Listen, it's very late, and if your mother hears what's happened, she'll be worried sick. We'll get a few more hours of sleep, and then try to get an early portkey out of here. Harry got back into his bunk with his head buzzing. He knew that he ought to feel exhausted. It was nearly 3 a.m, but he felt wide awake and worried. 3 days ago, it felt like much longer, but it had only been 3 days. He had awoken with his scar burning, and tonight, for the first time in 13 years, Lord Voldemort's mark had appeared in the sky. What did these things mean? He thought of the letter that he had written to Sirius before leaving Privet Drive. Would Sirius have got it yet? When would he reply? Harry lay looking up at the canvas, but no flying fantasies came to him now to ease him to sleep, and it was a long time after Charlie's snores filled the tent that Harry finally dozed off.